Welcome. It's good to imagine you there because I can't actually see you, but I'm really happy that you're here for this time of practice together. My name is Jonathan Foust, and I will be leading you through the following meditation and then yakking for a while on our topic for tonight, which is having a conversation with your inner critic. That's the pervasive quality of the inner critic. So thanks for making the time to be here. We have our traditional thank yous that we run through here. Some acknowledgments. First, a big thank you to Glenn Harrison and Leo Gimo for producing this event. Big thanks to you. Also, a big thank you to our mindful movement teacher and actually our teachers. We have 3 alternating teachers, Rita, Anna, and Lynn, who offer mindful movement at 6:30 p.m. on Monday Eastern Standard Time. It's a great way to prepare for meditation. Then after, a big thank you to Ray Manioki and Tara Cassidy, who offer mindful dialogue after this session, which is an opportunity to connect with like-minded people, to share about your practice, share about what's happening in your life. It's really it's a very cool thing to check out. So that's 6:30 mindful movement, 7:30 the meditation, 8 o'clock is the talk, and then after the talk at about 8:50, again, Eastern Standard Time, is Mindful Dialogue. You can get the links to the Mindful Movement and the Mindful Dialogue on my Facebook page or on my website. A big thank you to the Insight Meditation Community of Washington for hosting this class and all that they do, and to the good people at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Arlington, which has been the physical home of Monday Night Meditation for quite a while, and perhaps shall be again one day. If you'd like to sign up for the mailing list, please feel free. I offer, one is a weekly update, kind of telling you what's coming up next, and a monthly, where I offer a summary of the talks, kind of updates, photographs, stuff like that. So you can sign up on my website there. And as always, thank you for your support. This is all offered freely in the spirit of generosity so that no one is denied access to these practices and these teachings. And if you'd like to support this, please feel free. Your donations are gratefully accepted. Mostly, it just feels great to be able to practice together. It's such a radical act, slowing down, pausing, and coming into presence. So with that, let us move into our meditation practice. As you know, practice involves a number of qualities. One is this sort of arriving in presence, having an anchor in the senses that draws your attention back again and again and again. Of course, what normally happens is your mind is going to get distracted, so your mind is pulled away. And then the question becomes, what do you do when your mind is off wandering? The traditional thing the mind does, tied into the inner critic, is we beat ourselves up. You lost your concentration again. But one thing I'd like to offer for this meditation, and I'll refer to it a couple times, is when you notice your mind not here and you want it to be here, can you take a moment to appreciate the fact that you're awake? Just that sense of appreciation, or maybe even mild celebration, reinforces a kind of a sense of pleasure in that waking up and that re-arriving. So with that in mind, we'll prepare for our meditation. You might want to reach your arms up overhead, stretch up to the left side, the right side, open your jaw, let out any sounds. And you want to check your posture, see if your posture is going to support you where you feel aligned. If you like, you can close your eyes. It's okay to have your eyes open if you prefer. And take a few moments just to begin to sense what's here, what's happening. It's nice to start externally. If you take a few moments to notice the sounds around you. Notice the sounds that are at the furthest edge of your capacity to hear. Notice the sounds that are the closest in. You may notice that there is an effortlessness required to really listen and to hear. A sense of receiving the sounds. Can you open up just a feeling of the space around you right now? Moving in a little closer, sensing now the temperature of the air touching your skin, the texture of the air. Sensing the space around your body. And now sensing inward. Where do you feel the breath on the inside right now? And can you sense inside any sense of pulse or tingling, vibration, subtle energy? Are there any areas or regions inside that feel unpleasant, that feel tight or congested or stagnant or pulsing? Can you sense any areas or regions inside that feel pleasant, that may feel kind of free-flowing or easy or filled with a quality of ease? And can you sense who you are as the observer of all these sensations? You might now take some time to explore what it's like to soften and feel and arrive even more intimately on the inside. Your forehead smooth. Allowing the muscles of your face to begin to soften and relax, and just track that felt shift of relaxation. And can you bring that sense of relaxation into the inside of your mouth, the tongue, the lips, the jaw? On the back of the head and the base of the skull. On the back of the neck and the tops of the shoulders. You might imagine your arms like heavy drapes hanging from your shoulders as you sense now from the shoulder joints down through the elbows. And the elbows down through the wrists. And sensing now the volume of the palms and fingers and thumbs. And can you sense and relax and feel the throat? Relaxing, sensing, feeling the lungs and the heart. The diaphragm and the rib cage. The lower back and the buttocks. The belly and the lower abdomen. The floor, the pelvis, and the hip joints. As if you could sense from the inside, sensing now from the hip joints down through the knees. The knees down through the ankles. The tops of the feet and the toes. The soles of the feet and the heels. You may notice how the more deeply you relax, the more intimately you can feel. And now you might bring your attention to an anchor of your choosing, to the movement of the breath inside, or maybe to the sounds, maybe the palms of the hands. And for this next period of time, let this be your intention to be here fully for this time of practice. To explore what it's like to sustain your attention at the point of your focus. The movement of the breath on the inside, at the belly or the nostrils, to the vibration of sound, or to the sense of aliveness, of pulse or tingling in the palms. Whatever anchor you choose, explore what it's like to relax and feel and sustain your attention here. And when the mind wanders and you wake up with your mind far, far away, explore if you can let that be a moment of appreciation. Awake in here and now. Where is your mind right now? And if the mind has naturally wandered, take a moment to pause and to appreciate this moment of wakefulness. And here, take your time to re-arrive. Again, relax and feel. You might soften the palms, and the tongue, the soles of the feet. And as you're ready, again, re-arrive at the point of your anchor, deeply relaxed, feeling from the inside. Relaxed and alert, here and now. As it feels right for you, you might, from time to time, sense this seat of the observer, this quality of observation without judgment. And you might, if you wish, broaden and widen your awareness to the periphery, opening to the sense of all that is changing. Moving from relaxation to sustaining attention on your anchor, to widening and broadening your attention. Awake to what's changing and exploring what it means to let things be. You might notice in your practice how you may derive great benefit from focusing primarily on concentration. For the next 3 rounds of breath, how intimately can you sustain attention on your anchor? You may also derive benefit from exploring this quality of mindfulness. That is to say, to widen your awareness to the perception of all that's changing and to let things be. And you might sense what would be the most beneficial way to focus your attention, to sustain attention on your anchor, building the sense of presence in the here and now. Or does it feel more natural and helpful to toggle between concentration and this more open quality of awareness? You might, in your own time, refresh your practice. Perhaps again to relax your tongue and the muscles of the face. Could you soften the palms? The soles of the feet and the heels. Could you relax your lower back and the buttocks and the belly? How intimately now can you feel your anchor on the inside? Sensing this quality of the observer, this quality of observing without preference, relaxed, alert. Exploring what it means to let things be, just as they are. And you might, if you feel drawn, allow any practice of doing to melt away. Any sense of doing, of concentration or focus or control. Let that soften and explore what it's like to rest in presence. This quality of being, nowhere to go and nothing to do, just simply to be, deeply relaxed, alert, open, and spacious awareness. What could relax or soften right now? What could let go? You might now very, very gently, you might slow down and deepen your breath just a little bit. Just feel the breath on the inside. Relaxed and alert. You might, in your own time, very gently let your head drift a little bit to the left and to the right. Just sense the movement from the inside. And as you're ready, take some time just to stretch and move in any way that feels good for you. There's no rush, no hurry. How does your body want you to move? You might again reach your arms up overhead. Stretch up through the left side, the right side. Let out any sounds. Welcome. I heard the story of someone who said, finally, after years of struggle, I went to a therapist, and my therapist diagnosed me with low self-esteem. She said it was common among losers. That's just so sad. If you pay attention to your mind, if you meditate, which is paying attention to your mind, you'll notice that you may have this baked-in propensity for self-judgment. You may notice how you're constantly falling short of expectations, and how sometimes it feels like this nonstop barrage of critical thoughts. It's good news and bad news. The good news is you're not unique. The bad news is it's pretty pervasive. And that self-talk, that that inner critic can definitely color your perception of reality. And what I'd like to talk about, again, as I usually do in 4 parts. Part 1, acknowledging how your inner critic has kept you alive so far. And part 2, a little bit on the birth of the inner critic. Where does that voice come from? Part 3, the awakening of wise discrimination. How can the inner critic actually become a voice of wisdom? And part 4, how do you tune into that? How do you find that balance in your life? Imagine, or you don't have to imagine this, but let's just say a plane crashes over a remote forest. Horrible crash, but there are a few survivors, and everyone is hungry and exhausted, and you see that there are these yellow flowers with these really juicy red berries, and they look really, really good, and you're really, really hungry. But there's some inner voice that says, don't eat these. These might kill you. I'm not sure these are really, really safe. And so you don't. And then you watch someone else eat the red berries and they get sick. Well, that's score 1 for the inner critic. You know that voice that says, don't do that, this is scary, something terrible could happen? Well, it's this self-protective, self-preservational voice, which we tend to think of as the voice of the critic. It's kind of the built-in negativity bias that is kind of designed to keep you alive and keep you on the planet. It can be very, very helpful in your life, and it can really hold you back and stymie you. But our whole life is designed around waiting to see who eats the red berries first. It's designed around self-preservation. And our whole life, you could say, is built on distrust. You know, when you clink glasses at a dining room table before a meal, clink, 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 well, that really comes from a tradition of, I'll pour a little bit of wine into your glass, you pour a little bit of wine into my glass, so we're going to assure each other that we're not being poisoned. Shaking hands. Well, the roots of shaking hands is to make sure your fighting hand is immobilized. And why left-handed people were very sinister. The word sinistra means left-handed. You can shake someone's hand and still have your weapon hand free. But this sense of distrust has kept us alive, and we're basically the product of generations and generations and generations assuming the worst. And so we look for the worst. We're always looking for the bad news. I don't know, am I the only one? But I really think obituaries would be a lot more interesting if they told you how someone died. Have you ever found yourself, you're reading an obituary? Yeah, okay, but how? How did she die? This sort of negativity bias, this sort of scanning, this kind of this critical mind, this looking for what doesn't fit, it runs us. But when we begin to slow down, we begin to notice how pervasive it really is. And there was a woman on a retreat who was part of these small groups. And on our intensive retreats, quite often we have these groups of about 8 people. And she was listening to everyone share about their discoveries during the week. And she had considered herself to be a low achiever in life, although she acknowledged she was quite bright. And she reported out that she was so aware now that she was slowing down and paying attention of this voice in her head that kept saying, I'll never be as good as others. I'm not worthy of being successful. I'm not attractive enough. I'm not smart enough. And she reported how in her meditation, she was just fighting this voice. She hated this voice and where it came from. And she realized that the voice was actually always there in the background. And as she just sat with it for a couple days, she realized that she couldn't win. she wasn't going to win by fighting it and trying to suppress it. And so we talked about some strategies for being with it, like looking at the statements themselves, realizing how the negative self-talk is kind of a habit. She realized it was just sort of a habit of mind, that she would sort of rotate through these thoughts. And she started to explore, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, what would happen if she befriended the voice? Instead of trying to suppress it or get angry with it, what if she just kind of let it be? What if it wasn't the enemy? Maybe she could shift her relationship with it. And so she went back to her retreat exploring, okay, here it is. Here's this negative self-talk. Trying to like suppress it and kill it isn't working. What if I just explore what it's like to befriend it? We'll talk a little bit more about what happens when you do that. But it does bring up this interesting question. How does this inner critic get so strong in the first place? A teacher once said that, when we're young, we're like this little hard drive without any virus protection. We just pick up this programming that just gets installed. And as we go through life, as we become more aware, we have to start removing those the software programs that aren't really working for us. And it's uncanny how much we pick up when we're young and how much we assume this is reality. Back many, many years ago, when I used to do a lot of fundraising, I would lead these workshops, and I would always offer this inquiry. One thing my parents always said about money was, and just fill in the blank. And if you ask yourself that, what's one thing your parents always said about money? Oftentimes people say it doesn't grow on trees, you've got to work hard for it. And then the next question is, how much does what they said still operate as a way that you view the world? And the money thing is really interesting. How much we just pick up and assume this is the way life is. My parents were both Depression kids. My father worked for a state university. We didn't have a lot of money. We lived well, but we lived very, very frugally. I remember when I was 8 or 9, when we first went to a restaurant, we were traveling somewhere, I think, or like a summer, we would go camping in Maine. Normally we would just, peanut butter and jelly in the car, but for some reason we stopped at an actual diner. It was the first time I'd ever been in a restaurant. And as we went out to the car afterward, I was very proud of myself. And I went to my father, I said, "Dad, you left this money on the table." Not realizing what a tip is. My parents were so frugal. In their late 70s, they were going to be driving out to Colorado to see some friends. And at that time, they had a Ford Explorer, kind of the big SUV. And so they were telling me about their trip. And I said, "Well, how long will it take?" They said, "Well, we think about 3 days to get out there." And I said, "So you're going to just stay in motels?" And my 78-year-old father gave me this look. And he just said, "We have the Explorer." So in their late 70s, fully retired, why would you spend money on a motel when you've got a comfortable car and you can sleep in the parking lot? I didn't realize how much this had colored my own perception until later, many years later, when I moved to DC. I had a van that was just falling apart, and I had to replace it. And Tara said, "Look, I have this station wagon, which is pretty utilitarian. Why don't you buy a small car? Maybe buy a convertible." And I thought, yeah, I'll buy a small car. Maybe I'll buy a little convertible. That'd be fun. But I felt kind of sick for days. And finally, I realized what it was. I said to Tara, I said, "I'm sorry, but I can't buy a car I can't sleep in." That was real. That was real. Got to have your backup. So we're the product of our culture. We don't realize how much we pick up from our environment. I grew up in the Pennsylvania Dutch country on a farm. And all the neighborhood kids, all the school kids I knew as we were growing up through elementary school were mostly excited about hunting and guns and cars. And I was pretty excited too. And like them, I got my first gun at a certain time. And then I shot a frog and I felt sick about it. I really, really felt like physically ill as to what I did to this poor frog. And I lost my interest in hunting almost immediately. And what I really liked was reading. And to that culture, that agricultural culture, really being into reading was a direct and immediate sign of my flagrant and blatant homosexuality, according to them. And I didn't fit in. Just harsh judgment for not fitting into this, hunting macho culture. Luckily for me, I made my way into a culture that was much more of a fit for me, but I can still sense those inner voices. So when you reflect on your origins, when did you first have a thought of not being enough? It might have been your sense of self-perception in elementary or high school. Can you recall how young were you when you started comparing yourself to others? When did you start being afraid of failure? When was it important to you that you be seen as a success? Again, we pick up so much information about who we are from our externals. And as soon as we move into comparing mind, we are planting a seed. An interesting perspective I find is looking from the perspective of the kleshas. This is through yoga philosophy. This is just part of the human experience and how we grow into separation. The first occurrence is what's referred to as avidya. And the word vidya in Sanskrit means knowledge or wisdom. And whenever you see the word a before a word, it means the opposite of that. So it's actually wrong knowledge or ignorance. And the first step into ignorance that we make is believing that we are separate from Source. As soon as we have that thought of I'm separate, we then move right into the next, which is referred to as asmita, which is the formation of the ego. You start gathering evidence of how you're a separate and unique being. And the more you invest into who you are as a separate and unique being, then you invoke what's referred to as raga and dvesha, which is your attachments and your aversions. The things you like, the things you don't like. And as you accumulate this over your life, as you build up this story of who you are as this separate being, this separate entity, the more you build up the stuff you like, the stuff you don't like, you then build into the final klesha, abhinivesha, which is the clinging to life and the fear of death. When you have invested all of your time and attention and energy into who you are as this separate being, and it all falls away, when the body falls away, the mind falls away, that fear of death is absolutely terrifying. To the degree you are identified as this separate being, to that degree you will fear death. Which is why quite often some traditions say that meditation is dying while alive. It's about seeing your aversions, seeing the desires, seeing the self-criticism, and seeing how it is essentially empty. Seeing the reality behind it. And in that dying while alive, there becomes more space. As you become less caught in your conditioning, you have access to what we can think of as unconditioned awareness, that sense of freedom, that sense of ease. So when you look at the inner voice of the critic, it's really helpful to look at, where did you pick that up? When did you start believing it? As soon as we move into comparing and judging, we are, as the third Zen patriarch said, invoking the disease of the mind. And we see this now. The more time people spend on social media, the more it ties into depression. Because so many people, of course, on social media are trying desperately to present their perfect life. And we tend to believe it. So again, the bad news is that this inclination to move into judging and comparing, this identification with this kind of phantom sense of self that is not permanent, is quite pervasive. The good news is there's a way out. And funnily enough, it has something to do with self-awareness and mindfulness. So when we're caught in the critic, that ruthless critic that is kind of unceasing, we really begin to sense what it's like to be really caught and trapped by that mental formation. But just as the critic is saying, don't eat the yellow flowers with the red berries, there's also some wisdom in there. And this is where, as you pay attention to the inner critic, you can begin to discern that there can be a quality of wisdom. And it's referred to quite often as the awakening of wise discernment, the capacity to compare and judge through the lens of wisdom. Now, it's very hard to wake up to this stuff. And one of the ways that helps you to wake up is this practice of meditation, because you see more and more clearly into the nature of the mind. You begin to see the beliefs. You begin to see that programming that you picked up that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with truth. It feels real, but it's not true. And the more you pay attention, and particularly I find when you go to like a meditation retreat, when you really have time to really examine the thoughts, and you begin to see the top 10 beliefs or thoughts that just keep cycling through, you can begin to sense the whole operating system that's just below the surface. In one of these retreats, one of the retreatants came for a one-on-one interview. And she said, I've come to realize that I am doomed when it comes to relationships in my life. I've been sitting here for days reviewing all of my failures. And I've come to see I'll never be in a happy relationship in this life. I'm too damaged. I'm too old. I'm too needy. So there's a very interesting thing we can do here. As you're familiar, perhaps, with the practice of RAIN, the R, to recognize or realize what's happening. The A, to sense if you can allow it or accept it. Sometimes you can't. The I, to actively investigate that phenomena. And then the N, to nurture what you discover with some quality of loving presence. So much of this inquiry, as you may be familiar with it, is exploring how your issues are in your tissues. It's very much of a somatic investigation, but you can actually do this investigation on a thought. So she had mentioned this thought of I'll never be in a happy relationship. So we did an investigation into this. And I asked her, is it true? And she said, well, based on all the evidence of my life, yes. I said, well, do you absolutely know it's true? Absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt. She said, well, I can't know anything absolutely, but I'm 99.8% sure that I'll never be in a happy relationship. And all you need is that 1/10 or 0.2%. And so I asked her, what's it like inside when you believe that thought, that you'll never be in a happy relationship? And she closed her eyes. I could instantly see this kind of internal collapse. And she said, I feel hopeless. I feel like I'm too damaged. I feel an immense sadness. So we hung out with that a little bit, and brought a little bit of compassion, a little bit of kindness to that. And I said, so here's this thought that comes through. You'll never be in a happy relationship. And you know it's not absolutely true, but when you think that thought and you believe it, here's this inner collapse, this sense of hopelessness. I said, is there a sense of how old this is? She sat with that and she said, oh my God, it's just so old. I'm realizing that how disappointed I was with my parents, how I could never get what I needed from them. And I remember giving up really, really young. And so we took some time to be with that, to realize just how long that had been living on the inside. And when she had a sense of how deep the tendrils of this thought, this belief were, I asked her the samurai sword question. I asked her, who are you without that thought? There's a long pause. And she said, I have no idea. And we explored what it felt like inside to not have an idea of what that would be like. And she made room for that, and something shifted. There was a spaciousness that I could sense on the inside. There was this softening through her face. Just this glimpse that maybe that's not true. In meditation, we speak of this quality of the witness, or the observer, or mindfulness. You can substitute all different kinds of words, but I like to think of mindfulness as non-judging awareness. I like to think of it as awareness without preferences. It just sees what's there. It just lays it bare. And when you begin to examine what your inner critic is telling you, and you really see it for what it is, it can be kind of brutal, but it can also feel really truthful. The signs of the inner critic. You find yourself wondering if people really like you. If you ever feel anxious about feeling competent. If you have concerns about being perfect, or being fearful of making mistakes. If you get distressed about lacking confidence, the imposter syndrome, or you get really apprehensive of other people's opinions, or perhaps if you feel shame about the past, if you've experienced any of these, you may notice how your mind will turn it over and over and over and over. much of this it's habitual thinking. It's just a habit. And the first step to freedom is seeing it. So here's a definition of the inner critic. The inner critic is an internalized authority figure. That's a really interesting perspective. It's the internalized authority figure. It overrides and intimidates the part that would like to express itself into paralyzed silence in order to avoid potential criticism from the external environment. The healing occurs when you can express yourself freely where you weren't able to before. So, this internalized authority figure that just shuts down and paralyzes everything. The healing occurs when you can express yourself freely, or as I like to say, what you can't communicate controls you. What you can't communicate controls you. And what you can begin to set you free. So we'll explore a reflection on a thought in just a little bit. But I'd like to share a little bit about this arising of wise discernment. How the ruthless critic is very, very close to offering you some good counsel from time to time. I was in the Peace Corps for a couple of years in West Africa, and I lived in Niamey, the capital city of Niger. And as I was tootling along on my motorcycle, I saw this crazy Westerner with a loaded down touring bike, a bicycle on the edge of the Sahel. And the Sahel is the wasteland that's right next to the Sahara. And I pulled over. I just had to say hello, and I got to meet this fellow, Kevin Hickey. He had just crossed the Sahara from north to south on his bicycle, the first Western to do it. And he was pretty sick, and he stayed with me for a good while he was recuperating. And over that time, he told me all the tips and tricks for being on the road on a bike for 5 years. The guy had been everywhere. He played music on the street. He'd meet people who would point him the next thing to do. And there was something so epic about his travel. I got so inspired. And with it, I got obsessed. So I had a bike made in Switzerland on his recommendation. And this is before mountain bikes, just to kind of date it a little bit. So the widest tires were only like 35C tires, but it had a reinforced frame. The spokes were tied and soldered. And during my summer break, I picked it up in Switzerland. I traveled around Europe. Then I brought it back. And that next year, I got in the best shape of my life. Really learned how the bike, this is before sealed bearings, so I had to repack the bearings there like every week because the dust and sand would get in. And I had told everyone in the world that this is what I was doing, and I had really given all my energy to preparing for it. But this critic started coming in. And this voice started saying, like, look, you're not strong enough to do this. What if you start getting migraines out on the road? What if no one helps you? What if you get robbed? And I hate this part of me. I hate this part of this fearful part of me, where I get paralyzed. I don't take risks. And that particular season, as I was getting ready to go, the hot season came early. And by hot, I mean hot, 120 degrees at times. And these harmattan winds, these dust-laden winds come down off the Sahara. They were really terrible that year. It looks like fog, but it's dust. But I was so aversive to this fearful critic that I just pushed off, and I did a kind of a trial leg to test my gear, and the heat was just crazy. I wrapped up my head as many people did in that culture. And, what I discovered was that inner critic saying, this is really stupid. What's going to happen out there? It was absolutely right. It was an incredibly stupid thing for me to do. I got chronic nosebleeds from the dust getting in my sinuses. I became anemic. My nervous system was completely fried. I made it back to try to recover and to try to do it again. And again, the fear arose. And I did this little meditation where I thought, okay, so here's this inner critic that's just unrelenting, telling me I should be careful and this isn't safe. And I thought to myself, well, I really want to get rid of it, but how much do I want to keep? And I realized, well, I would actually like to keep most of this inner critic. And I saw how this was actually a voice of wisdom. It was actually a voice, it was an ally. It was really looking out for me. And when you think of the inner critic, it becomes a very interesting inquiry. That even though the critic can be unrelenting and be unreasonable, that there's some element in there where the critic is a part of you sincerely looking out for you. And so while there is this scanning for self-preservation, and while there is this hallucination around all the terrible things that could go wrong, the shadow or the other side of the coin is that there's something here that is wanting you to be healthy, wanting you to be alive, wanting you to be fully expressed. So when you find yourself with the unreasonable critic, when you're worried about whether people will like you, if you feel anxious about feeling inadequate, if you're not feeling perfect, or you're afraid of making a mistake, or lacking confidence, or caring too much about what people think of you, or feeling shame from your past, how do we bring a sense of healing to this? One of the ways you can is to remember you're not alone. That phrase, other people feel this too, can be tremendously helpful. When they've done studies about people who feel like they're not really adequate to what's being asked of them, the imposter syndrome, 90% of humanity or something crazy like that feels that. Each one of these thoughts, the thoughts of the inner critic, the voice of the inner critic, they occur for every single person. The second thing you can do when you notice this unrelenting critic is to name it. As soon as you can name it, you begin to shift your identification with it. Sometimes people have found it helpful just to give the inner critic a name. Someone said, okay, he named his inner critic Carl. I don't know why Carl. But he would just say, look, Carl, I hear you. Thank you for sharing. The second is to explore what it's like to befriend it. What does it really have to tell you? When you sit down to have a conversation with it, what's the message here? It might be telling you, it might be saying something around, look, you're not ready for this next meeting and you're going to fail. But if you really sit down and explore that thought, there may be a message in there around, it would be wise to explore how you might prepare a little better for that meeting. Or it might be helpful to have an ally in that meeting to kind of help you move through whatever you need to move through. Another way to sense the inner critic is to imagine that it's a servant. Because what happens is, when the inner critic establishes itself as the ultimate authority, it's not a servant anymore, it's a master. But when you take this stance of the observer, the witness, and that inner critic is actually a voice that's here to serve you, sometimes that can really help to reframe the situation. What does it really want you to know? And what I've found for myself is that when I fight the voice of the inner critic, what I'm doing is I'm giving it power. When I can sit down and really listen to it, because oftentimes what it really needs, at least for me, is it needs for me to listen. It sounds like it wants me to obey, but what it really needs is for me to listen. And when I can listen, sometimes I can sense it actually has a message for me. This inner critic is all about ultimately about freedom. When you feel the inner critic establishing itself as an authority, that's when the struggle becomes. When you can begin to cultivate this sense of mindfulness, of preferenceless awareness, and have tea with the critic, then sometimes there can be a dialogue that might result in some wisdom coming your way. So we're running out of time, but I thought I might lead a short little reflection, and then we're going to end with a little quote. So if you like, you can close your eyes. And you might just take some time to slow down and deepen your breath. Quite often I find that the voice of this inner critic in essence will come down to a belief that either you're not good enough or there's something wrong with you. And you might just take a moment. And as you slow down the breath, and you might, if you like, just choose one of these as a statement or a belief. There's something wrong with me. Or I'm not good enough. Just choose one of those. And you can ask yourself if this is true. And you may find that there's something inside that says yes, but we're really looking at absolute. Do you absolutely know that to be true? And while it may not be absolutely true, you might just sense for a few moments, when you think that thought and you believe that thought, how does that thought live on the inside? Can you locate that? Is it possible to trace that back? How old is that thought? When did you start to think that thought and believe it? And can you sense where that lives on the inside? Can you locate whatever feelings may be most predominant right now? And you might sense, is it possible to bring a sense of loving presence, of kindness or compassion or empathy? You might bring it to whatever felt sense you locate inside. And you might explore this next question. Here's this thought. Sometimes you believe it. When you believe it, this is what it feels like on the inside. Who are you without that thought? Just sensing the possibility of glimpsing who you are with the inner critic is not a master, but a servant. If you like, you can deepen your breath. If you like, you can open your eyes. Becoming more aware and having conversations with the inner critic has everything to do with freedom, with personal freedom and with full freedom. And I thought I would just close with this reading from Matthew Ricard, who talked about like this sense of freedom, not only for us individually, but for us as a culture. He says, you start with freedom from thirst and hunger, disease, the basic freedoms that the state has to help its citizens to achieve. Then you go beyond that to social freedom, from discrimination, equality, from crime, from lawlessness and insecurity. Then ultimately you find further up the ladder political freedom, the freedom from authority and tyranny. And then Buddhism brings you to even past that, to freedom from internal bondage. I think it can be so helpful to really sense, what is this that's between you and feeling free? And when the inner critic, the voice of the inner critic is strong, sometimes you can turn toward it to recognize that other people feel this too, to name it, and to move toward it, to sense, what does this have to tell you? Is there some wisdom in this message? In so doing, you are taking this stance of the witness. Your capacity to observe without judgment, your capacity to observe without preference, and ultimately the possibility of coming in intimate contact with something which has bound you, and sensing who you are, free of that bondage. It's pretty cool stuff. And I'm really, really happy to share these practices with you. I hope this has been helpful. May you and your inner critic have a wonderful time together, and may you have tea, and may you come into a great sense of harmony, of wisdom, and compassion. Thanks so much for your time, for your attention, and best wishes.